Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, Biosimilars, What's New and What's Next, organized by the Florida Society of Clinical Oncology. FLASCO is a member-supported state society that focuses on supporting and representing the oncology workforce of Florida. Together, FLASCO is the voice of oncology in Florida. Many of the individuals participating in the webinar today are FLASCO members, and we appreciate their support. My name is Dr. Jorge Garcia. I'm the Assistant Vice President of System Oncology Pharmacy Services at Baptist Health South Florida. I have the pleasure of serving today as both the moderator and presenter for the webinar tonight. The topic of this evening is biosimilars. Biosimilars represent a unique opportunity to increase access to care for patients while still offering safe, effective, and high-quality treatment options. I would like to thank Pfizer for sponsoring this webinar and making it possible for us to share this important information. Before we begin the presentations, I would like to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded so that those who are unable to attend can view it at a later time. Also, your lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. During our presentations, we will pause for Q&As, so we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the on-screen question box on the GoToWebinar panels throughout the presentations, and we will discuss as many questions as time allows. It is an honor for me to introduce my fellow panelists for this evening's webinar, Dr. Wayne Weingarten. Dr. Weingarten is a senior fellow in business and economics at the Pacific Research Institute, as well as the director of Pacific Research Institute's Center for Medical Economics and Innovation. He will begin the presentation by discussing the role of biosimilars in managing drug spend and promoting affordability. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Weingarten, and now I'll turn it over to you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, and I guess a great way to start this is right with the title. You know, biosimilars, what's new and what's next. If we look at what's new, it's that we're finally beginning to see some real growth in the amount of the market share of biosimilars. And that's very exciting because it has important implications for the drug affordability problem, which is really kind of how we at the Center for Medical Economics and Innovation, how we became interested in this issue, because biosimilars are such an important part of addressing the drug affordability issue while also keeping the incentive for innovation. And in terms of what's next, hopefully we're going to be able to build off of the momentum that we're currently seeing. We're going to be able to get the types of reforms necessary to get biosimilars up to a market share that we're seeing in the EU, up to a market share that's similar to what we see with generics. And from that, we're going to actually be able to meaningfully address the drug affordability problem. I'd like to, I guess, let me start with what the objectives are with respect to overall drug regulation, because I think that's why biosimilars are so important, right? When you're regulating the drug industry or regulating pharmaceuticals, we have two competing goals that we need to deal with, right? We need to incent innovation and we need to promote affordability. Incenting innovation means we need to allow companies, the innovative companies that have come up with innovative medicines, the opportunity, and that's very key, the opportunity to recoup their cost of capital. Capital costs are different than R&D expenditures because it also includes financing costs, it includes the value of time, the risk. All of these things need to be compensated for if you're going to have a viable, innovative industry. Now, we've actually used competition very effectively, and I think that is an important example. Then we'll start the presentation with this. We have an important example of competition meeting both of these goals. In other words, by enabling competition for generics after you've given innovative drugs an opportunity, it's usually about 11.5 years once all the requirements are met, about 11.5 years of exclusivity still exists for the innovator to recoup their cost of capital, but then afterwards generics come in and compete, and that competition drives down price. And this process of exclusivity for a set period, followed on by competition, is the most successful way that we found to strike that right balance and to have both innovation and affordability. And if we look at the generic market, which really was enabled by the Hatch-Waxman Act, if we look at the generic market, we see that at this point, you're talking about 90% of all drugs sold at the pharmacy counter are generics. And I think that's worth repeating, right? 90%. So the vast majority of drugs sold at the pharmacy counter are generics. The vast majority of those, about 92%, are sold for $20 or less, and the out-of-pocket costs are somewhere around $7. So we're talking about the vast majority of drugs are affordable when you're talking about small molecule drugs sold at the pharmacy counter, right? That's due to competition. The exclusivity part has enabled all sorts of new innovative drugs to have emerged over the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and to treat cancer, autoimmune diseases. All of these important drugs have come to market. So we're striking that right balance when it comes to the small molecule market. Because we struck that right balance, and that's what this slide here is demonstrating, because we've struck that right balance, what you actually see are expenditures on prescription drugs are not growing faster than overall healthcare expenditures. And I think that's a misnomer that a lot of people have when we talk about the healthcare affordability issues. The policy debate often just kind of zeroes in right there on prescription drugs. But if you look at the data, that's not really what you see. Some years it's a little more expensive. You see prescription drugs going faster. Other years you see it going slower. Over the long term, what you see is prescription drugs going in line with overall expenditures. And same with hospital costs, same with professional services costs, which are doctors and nurses and physicians assistants. They all grow similarly because these are all complementary goods, right? We need all of these resources to treat people effectively. And what you actually see is a little bit of a side note when you're talking about what's driving affordability, and it's a slightly different issue than biosimilars, but I think it's worth emphasizing while we're discussing this, and that's what this chart here is showing, it's the middlemen, it's insurer and administrative costs that are a growing share of our overall expenditures. So what the chart on my screen that you're seeing now is, it's looking at the share of overall healthcare expenditures from 1960s going by decade, and then once we get to the 2000s by year, the share that goes to hospitals, the share that goes to physicians and nurses and doctors assistants, the share that goes to prescription drugs, and then that middleman. And what you see when you look at it, that red bar, you see that expanding, whereas the shares that go into prescription drugs, hospitals, shares that go into physicians, that's all declining as a share, and most of that's being in the middleman, I should say. So that's an important, when we're talking about overall drug affordability, bit of a side note, but I think it's important to emphasize, that's another area that we need to address. And until we address that, we won't actually fully address affordability issues. However, biosimilars, just the way generics have, are a meaningful way to address the drug affordability problem. And the reason is this chart that's on my screen right now. When you look at what's been driving growth in overall drug net spending, so this is spending on drugs net of all the concessions paid. And you see that traditional drugs, right, they're small molecules where we have robust generic competition, those prices had been declining for the past 6-7 years, and it's about 5 years, right? Whereas overall drug spending is slightly increasing, and that increase is due to the specialty drugs, in other words, biologics. So biosimilars are such an important part, not the whole part, but such an important part of the whole drug affordability question, because when you look at what's driving the spend, right, the driving the spend are the originator biologics. And you can see that also if we break down that spending by its component parts, right? Total spending can be going up because you're using more of the drug, because the price is increasing, or a combination of the both. Same thing with if it's going down. And what we see is, with respect to biologics, both the use of the drugs are going up and the prices are going up. And that's a big difference between the traditional drugs where we have that competition, right? Where we have the competition, the unit costs are going down, right? And it's the use of the drugs that's driving the net spend, right? Again, very important issue, another important data point illustrating that competition brings down prices. And so if we want to address the drug affordability issue, we need to address the prices in the biologics market. And the way to do that is biosimilars. So biosimilars is just such an important part of that kind of component. If we're talking about how much, right, that we're talking about spending, we're talking about a small share of total prescriptions, but over 40% of the total spend, and that's back in 2019. So again, the way to address drug affordability is through kind of promoting the biosimilars. And for a number of years, it's been very difficult to stand up kind of that biosimilar market. The kind of what's new, and I kind of love that in the title. I didn't come up with it, but I wish I did. In terms of what's new is we're actually beginning to see broad-based kind of use of biosimilars across a wider array of biologic drugs. And that's very exciting because of what we had just talked about. The key to kind of improving affordability is getting that kind of biosimilar market stood up. Now, in the EU, that market has been more advanced and it's been much larger for a longer period of time. And you can see that a lot more biosimilars, 69, have been approved in the EU compared to only 36 here in the US. Now, that 36 is an improvement. We have 25 marketed, and there's only one, though, with more than 50% market share, and that's kind of the what's next. We got to get that 50% even higher, and we need to get more biosimilars up to that threshold. If you look at the EU market, and I think this is a nice slide that kind of shows the possibility, right? Because we know in the small molecule market here in the US, the generics have 90% market share. In the EU, and this is related by country, you can see there's some countries that have 100% biosimilar share. The average is about 66%, right? So I think this is kind of giving us, between 66 and 90%, that's giving us a range of what is possible in terms of how much that market share of biosimilars could be. And one of the things we've been doing at the Center for Medical Economics and Innovation is trying to kind of put a figure around, well, what are the potential savings? How important is this in terms of reducing total drug spend if we can get to those levels? And part of the reason we feel that's so important is by quantifying it, by putting those numbers out there, we're emphasizing the potential savings, how important it is, and then, well, what do we need to do to reach that? So as a part of demonstrating how important it is, what are the savings? And I'd like to take the next few slides to kind of walk through those with you. And one of the things you notice, again, in the EU, talking about 30% price discount on Epitine Alpha, some were a bit more than that, but the price discounts we're seeing here in the US are on par with what's happening across the EU. So this slide here, what we're looking at is, all the originator biologics that have competition. This is 6 of them, and it's looking at what's the price of the biosimilars as of the latest data, which is second quarter of 2021. So looking at that price relative to the price that existed in that originator biologic market prior to competition. And the reason why it's important to look at the price prior to competition, so what did Remicade sell prior to competition? And the importance of doing that is, especially, and Remicade is a great example of this, when biosimilars come in, one of the ways you get competition is that the originator products lower their prices. So the introduction of competition creates this, incentive for all prices to be lowered. And so comparing it to the prices prior to entry gives you a sense of what was the kind of, how pressure it brought to bring down prices. And what's also noteworthy is, and this goes across the board with all the originators, that the prices were going up prior to the introduction of biosimilars. Once biosimilars came in, at bare minimum, prices stopped going up. And in some cases, you saw prices of the originator comes down. So again, competition in this space is incredibly important because it drives down prices. And you can see in the US, we have prices that are between 27% to over 50% below where the prices were. So competition is working in terms of bringing down prices. What you can also see in this next slide, and I took that from Drug Channels Institute, is that what we're now beginning to see finally is broader use of biosimilars. So you can see in the filgrastim class, in terms of Zarcio, that's been a major kind of share of that market for many years. But for many years, that was really the only biosimilar that was meaningful in the marketplace. And that was continued through 2019. And now, all of a sudden, in 2020, we're finally beginning to see biosimilars and other classes begin to get a meaningful market share, where there's two classes, the biosimilars against Avastin and Herceptin, where we're beginning to get over 40, getting close to 50%. Some of the others, again, 20, 30%, but we're really beginning to see an uptick. And when you look at the savings, what you actually have seen is, obviously, when there's a greater share of a lower priced product, right, you're going to get more savings. And we're actually beginning to see the realized savings that we're getting now is going up, and the potential is even greater. So the importance of continuing this push of greater biosimilar use is that much more important. This gives you a sense of kind of the overall market. If you're looking at this pie chart, where total expenditures in 2020, right? So we know that for a fact 2020 has come to a close, right? We know that total expenditures in the 9 drug areas where there are biosimilar competition, that there's over $32 billion of expenditures, and a good deal of those expenditures are Humira and Enbrel, which we don't yet have biosimilars. So it's very important that we get competition into those classes sooner rather than later, because those are such large markets, and so would have a very meaningful impact on overall affordability once those biosimilars are competing, assuming they get picked up. But if you look at the savings in those other classes where we do have competitive products, you can see that we have that $32.4 billion in expenditures. But if we ask the question and kind of create a baseline, what would expenditures have been without competition, right? And that's what that second bar to the right is showing. So it's saying, okay, if prices were what the prices had been prior to competition, and kind of use that as our baseline of where expenditures are going, we could see that about $5 billion of savings to the healthcare system have been created by increased biosimilar use. The biosimilars have created $5 billion in savings. And again, the way we calculate those savings is we look at the prices prior to competition, and then we look at the volumes of today, and we say, okay, at today's value, at today's prices, what are we spending? What would we have been spending at the prices had not come down because of biosimilar competition? And then the $5 billion is the difference between the two. Now, in terms of kind of what's next, right, what we're actually seeing is going forward, right, for 2021, where we are today, if we just kind of project those trends forward, right, we were at about $4.9 billion in savings in 2020. For 2021, if we continue at the pace we're at, using the same methodology, we could actually get $7.1 billion in savings. So that's a tremendous amount of pressure off of the expenditures in the healthcare system. And if we address kind of some of the discount issues so that patients benefit from that, we're actually going to see a meaningful reduction in that affordability problem that's impacting patients by greater use of biosimilars. But it could be even better, right? Because this is, again, on average, if you looked at the market shares across those products and kind of weight them, you're talking really still only at 20, 30%. So we're getting $7.1 billion at 20, 30%. If we can get up to, and we're kind of taking a mid-range of kind of where the epithelial alpha are in EU, talking about 60%, 66%, or 90% generics, so take 75, it's a round number in between, we could be generating over $13 billion in savings if we can promote biosimilar use and bring the market share back up from where it is now all the way to 75%. So we could be nearly doubling the savings, just getting it to that 75% threshold. And importantly, that's only for the drugs that we're looking at now. It's not for additional competitors that will come in. And that's also assuming 75% share. Perhaps we can get it up to 80 or even to that 90% share, in which case the potential savings are even greater. But I think what's really important and what's really exciting is that these are big numbers, right? This is a lot of savings. This is very meaningfully address the drug affordability issue. And if we go back to that slide where we talked about the 46%, right, of the spending is coming from this biologic class, and I should say, the spending on the biologics has an incredible amount of healthcare value, and I think when we talk about like the innovative side, when we started talking about innovation, we shouldn't underappreciate what these originator products have done, right? They have, oncology, so I'm sure everyone is more familiar than I am with the benefits that the biologics have been able to bring to patients in terms of improving health outcomes and treating patients. So that is very important. That is the innovation part, and that needs to be rewarded. And to a large extent, it has been. But we also need to get that competitive part stood up, and that's where the biosimilars come in, and that's where we're beginning to see the savings. Something I like to bring in just to kind of convince that our calculations at the center aren't completely out of bounds. This is a chart by Alliance Bernstein, and they actually are showing that through the second quarter of 2020, you're talking about $6.5 billion of savings that come from the biosimilars. So I kind of put this in here just to kind of show we're not crazy, that there's other analysts coming out with a very similar estimate that we're talking about. Even at today's levels, some real serious savings that are out there because of the biosimilars. I think it's also important to note that these savings are available across the states, and we've estimated the savings is distributed to each state for both Medicare, Medicaid, as well as commercial patients. So across all those groups, you see a significant amount of savings is available in each state. And in Florida, you're talking about almost $1 billion a year in potential savings if we can hit that 75% threshold. So, for Florida itself, you're talking about a very meaningful impact. Now, some of those would be from Medicare, which would go to the federal government, but it still impacts patients who are living in Florida. But it would also, through Medicaid, impact the Florida state budget, commercial plans, businesses. I mean, across the board, it can make a very large difference for individuals and for patients and for the healthcare system overall. So we've seen that we've had some very impressive gains, but we also seen that it's important to do more. And that's what really these next two slides are talking about. So that there's things that employers and health insurers can do, and there's policy changes, all of which could help promote greater use of biosimilars. Either from an employer plan perspective, it's important to look at, what are your employees, are they using biologics, quantifying that, because as you start quantifying it, in a sense, educating yourself on the issue, those savings come out there. Creating special tiers for biosimilars that have better reimbursement rates, things along those lines that would encourage greater use of biosimilars. Very important kind of reforms to the plans. In terms of policies, we need to. I think the most important of all of these really is addressing the rebate walls, right, where you have basically discounts are being used as anti-competitive measures. It's something we could spend 20 minutes talking about on its own, but addressing that system, addressing the rebates, so that we remove rebate walls and that we allow competition to flourish, and that you don't disincent the use of a lower price product because a higher cost biologic is able to pay out higher rebates. These types of reforms to basically improve the incentives. And I think that's the key. We need to improve the incentives so that the value of biosimilars comes through and is not in effect dampened because of an ineffective system. And I guess with that, I'll open up either for questions or to turn the program back over to Dr. Garcia, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weingarten. Great to see economics on biosimilars. Myself being a provider, I hear a lot about the provider side of things, but it's really great to be able to look at these numbers that you've put together for us. I think what we could do for the sake of time is we can transition to the second part of the presentation, and then we'll do Q&As at the end of my portion. These are a few objectives here for today. We're going to talk about the utilization. Let me just turn on my cam here, if I can still see that. There we go. I think that that's working. Okay, good. So we'll review biologics utilization and cost trends. We'll talk about biosimilar barriers as it comes to market entry barriers. And then lastly, we'll review the role of biosimilars in value-based care. I think it's important to recognize that biologics have really revolutionized the treatment of serious conditions in the past 20 years. Looking back at 1970, biologics produced were mainly consisting of vaccines and blood products, and they only accounted for less than 10% of the overall pharmaceutical market. In the 1980s, with the rise of cloning gene expression technology and our ability to biosynthesize more genetically complex organisms, we were able to have more complex molecules. In 1982, as an example, we had Genentech's first recombinant human insulin. And then by 86, we saw the first FDA-approved monoclonal antibody, having a monoclonal antibody specifically for oncology in 1997. I think it's important to point out that there is just increased utilization of biologics overall. And that is provided by just the sheer number of biologics that continue to come into the market as different biologic therapy options that we have, but also recognizing that those treatments have improving side effects and toxicity profiles, now allowing us to really provide multiple concomitant lines of therapies for our patients. And it's not uncommon for oncology patients today, as an example, to be on multiple drugs at the same time. Also, the efficacy of these treatments is improving over time, leading to better overall survival. And so that's also leading to increased biologic utilization, sometimes in patients that may survive and may use additional biologics for comorbid conditions or for secondary cancer disease. And then lastly, we know that we have an aging population. So as we get better at treating chronic conditions and patients live longer, there is a higher chance that they may develop cancer later on in life. And so we know that that would increase biologics utilization. But as Dr. Weingarten pointed out, this isn't just a matter of utilization going up. We also know that the prices of these biologics per unit are also going up. And so that is what brings us over time to a very steady rate of increase in spend for biologics. And so when we look at biosimilars, we're really looking at that as an imperative to perhaps not decrease the spend on biologics, but to reduce the rate of increase as we implement more biosimilars in the marketplace. So I think all of this has really brought us to pharmaceuticals that have reached an all-time high cost. We also know that that cost in oncology specifically is growing at twice the rate of the rest of the healthcare cost increases. We also know that the median monthly cost of US cancer drugs have surpassed the median monthly household income in year 2000. And now by 2014, the spend on the cancer drugs more than double the median household income. And those of you who work closely with cancer patients can experience firsthand the financial toxicity that cancer patients experience. And so the biosimilar value proposition is exactly to continue to bring those treatment options to the patients at a fraction of the cost. So we know that patent expirations for biologics is now reaching over $20 billion in global annual spend. And we know that biosimilars are expected to assume the majority of the market share. We know several innovator companies have pursued and some already launched biosimilars as part of their portfolio. We know that the unsustainable and yet still rising healthcare costs really calls for cost mitigation strategies. And we were faced with a similar phenomenon about 30 years ago with synthetic drugs that were just available in the branded form. And we were able to mitigate a lot of that cost by introducing generics successfully in our market in a model that have been sustainable for many years. Now, I think it's important to recognize that biosimilars still today face many, many barriers, and this could take place before the marketing of the biosimilar and after the marketing of the biosimilar. Just to provide an example of a pre-marketing barrier, patent litigation is very, very common in this space. You may also hear this described as patent dance in the literature. And I think we relatively know that the biologics exclusivity that is provided to all the biologics here in the US by the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act is necessary and is fair to continue to channel research and development. What most of us may not know is that patent exclusivity may be there for the compound at hand, but there is many other aspects of that compound that may also be patented. Examples of that includes formulations, delivery systems, thinking about things like on-body devices, the absorption, and many other parts of the molecule. So this does leave a lot of room for infringing litigation. And again, this is affecting biosimilars, delaying their launch here in the US by a month to years. I want to share with you a specific example that showcases this, and that is the case of adalimumab. This product lost initial exclusivity period in 2016 here in the US. The product has a total of 247 US patents, 89 of which came after the product's launch, and 49% of these patents came after the first patent had actually already expired. Now, adalimumab is the leading biologic in terms of spend globally, with $20 billion in sales just in year 2018, and that's at twice the rate of the second highest in the list. Today, as of today that I checked the FDA website, we have 6 approved adalimumab biosimilars. These are companies that have completely completed their biosimilar development program. The biosimilars are just standing by for these settlements to take place so that they can come into the market. And what that looks like is the earliest that we would see adalimumab here in the US is in the year 2023. And now additional patent laws may still extend this further, even beyond 2023. So we need to continue to monitor that. By contrast, we know that adalimumab is not only biosimilar approved, but also being marketed in the European Union since October of 2018 with great discounts there. So this brings a lot of concerns about the true intent of the US patent law, and it brings concerns about anti-competitive pay for delay. And so lots of questions about that in our country, and we know and we're able to quantify that the patent delays are really having an impact of about $7.5 billion since 2015 here in the US. Now, the same company that manufactures adalimumab now has 2 other treatments that they offer. The first you're looking at in the screen here is risankizumab, and this treatment is showing improved effectiveness in severe plaque psoriasis, and it also has a more favorable dosing schedule. They also have an oral ipadacitinib, and this product is now showing improved efficacy in RA. A while back, when I came across this information, ipadacitinib had 21 trials listed on clinicaltrials.gov. I checked today, and that's up to 47 clinical trials actively for this one product. So the point that I want to make here is we have 6 biosimilars completely developed and FDA approved. They have been, some of them have been approved since 2016. That's Amgen, who had that first approval. And these products are standing by, just waiting for the patent settlements on this. And by the time these biosimilars are allowed to come to the market here in the US in 2023, the standard of care may have shifted to a different product. So really, it is questionable how much biosimilar utilization will be there if there are products that show better efficacy or favorable dosing schedules or other benefits. So in general, I think it's important to highlight that the biosimilar industry continues to face many challenges. We know, for example, that there is no patent exclusivity for biosimilars. So that means that as many biosimilars for the same reference product can really come into the market, and there will be no control for that. We also know that there is no FDA designated interchangeability as of today in the US. And so that does create a limitation for providers outside of health systems that may have institutional policy that allows interchangeability for that to happen in the community when there's no FDA interchangeability without the previous approval of the provider prescribing the drug. We also know that many of the biosimilars have incomplete label indication, and that's fairly common. And we know that where that happens, it is not a limitation of clinical evidence. It tends to be more of a patent limitation, but that does translate into less biosimilars being used for those indications that they're not approved for. Also, we know that there is a lot of uncertainty about the order of market entry, and so it's very difficult for companies to try to understand how much risk they're willing to take when they don't necessarily know exactly when they're coming to the market. And of course, there is no guaranteed payer coverage. In fact, we know that payers do ask biosimilar companies for rebates to be able to preferentially position them in the formulary. And of course, we know that that practice is concerning because it does not allow biosimilar companies to bring biosimilars to the market at the lowest viable cost when they have to turn around and pay rebates for their biosimilars to be included in the payer's formulary. And so that means they have no guaranteed market share and of course not guaranteed sales either. Now, I like to look at the survey data coming from providers in the US who say that reimbursement is one of the top 3 challenges to biosimilar implementation. And I thought, having Dr. Weingarten here with an economics background, that I would focus today on the reimbursement piece as it more closely relates to the rest of our presentation. From a reimbursement standpoint, I think part of the challenge is that Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial plans have all approached biosimilar reimbursement in different ways. We do know when we look at Medicare that applies more consistently across the board to most of us. We see that CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, have taken a number of actions to really position biosimilars for success. One of those actions includes making sure that there is a unique HCPCS code so that each biosimilar company can manage the ASP of the product, just like the reference companies can manage the ASP of their product. And we know that the CMS payment is based on an ASP, average selling price, plus an administrative fee. We also know that Medicare publicly publishes every quarter the ASP for all the products, the reference product and the biosimilars, and we know that that's calculated by looking at the net revenue in sales divided by the total product units for that quarter. I think it's important that we review and monitor that ASP information closely on a quarterly basis because we're seeing some unique dynamics that we had not seen previously in the biosimilar space, where the ASP of reference product can actually go below the ASP of some of the biosimilars or several of the biosimilars in the class. We also know that CMS have position statements out there that really call for increasing the number of licensed biosimilars to increase competition in the marketplace in hopes that that will go ahead and continue to drive the price down. Now, briefly here, if you're a non-340B facility, your Medicare payment for biosimilars is going to be based on ASP plus 6%. When the reference product is all that you have, When the biosimilar comes in, that reimbursement is going to transition to the biosimilars WAC plus 3%, and that will last until an ASP is established for the biosimilar, usually 2 to 3 quarters into it, at which point you will get the biosimilars ASP plus a 6% of the reference product. Now, if you practice in a 340B entity, your payment from CMS is quite different, and that is for the reference product ASP minus 22.5% when the biosimilar is in the market, and if you adopt that, it will transition to ASP plus 6%. And that is not a coincidental difference there. It is a very intentional CMS enhancement to move you from ASP minus 22.5 to ASP plus 6 for the duration of the pass-through period as a CMS incentive to support biosimilars and other novel therapies on the provider side. Now, looking at the commercial plans, it's really been a challenge, very inconsistent biosimilar benefits. We know that there's very frequent changes. We know some of the health plans change their policies several times per year, really just putting a lot of stress on the providers to be able to implement these changes, and sometimes even patients as well. We know that due to these changes, the provider to payer formulary alignment is really not there, and that creates a lot of operational safety and efficiency issues on the provider side. And we also know that it does not provide us with the ability to build economies of scale just by being able to use one biosimilar or one reference product consistently. We know that this is primarily driven in the background by rebates, and so there's a lot of controversy around this, as I mentioned, that increases the overall cost of products in the marketplace. We know that these rebates take place sometimes on the eve of the biosimilar entry to the market. We are mindful that it costs payers multi-million dollars sometimes to move away from those rebates, and we know that payers do have to invest additional resources to organize that switch, the same way we as providers have to invest additional resources to organize changes on our end. We also know that these rebates are not designed to provide patients with lower out-of-pocket cost, and so what we're seeing is that really efforts here to try to move the needle are on infancy stages, but it's very important that we continue to do advocacy around this. And we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. We're seeing some things moving in the right direction, like this state bill in Minnesota that is really calling for health plans not to require or demonstrate a preference for the biosimilar or the reference product, but rather to give that choice to the patient and the provider based on the unique needs of that patient and the circumstances that that patient may be in. I just checked on the status of this bill yesterday, and it's been referred to the Health and Human Services Finance and Policy Committee in the state of Minnesota. So I will continue to follow this closely. Now, I want to do a quick stop here to check with the audience and see if we have questions at this point. We do have additional content that we would love to share with you, but we would like to prioritize your questions first. And so, as a reminder, we are here for your benefit, and we really would love to get some questions from you. So I'll open the floor now for questions, if you have any at this point. And what I will do here very quickly, maybe to help you organize your thoughts and the questions that you may want to type in, is I have a couple of comments that I think are worth highlighting as it relates to Dr. Weinsgarten presentation. The first is, it is always very encouraging to see how Europe, who has a biosimilar market that's about 6 years more mature than ours, be so successful across the board. I think that there are a few differences that position them for success. And again, I think these are potential advocacy opportunities for us back here in the States. But the first is the patent law pharmaceuticals in Europe does not seem to be as strict as patent laws that we have here in the US. I think the adalimumab example that I provided is a good example of that, where they already have access to biosimilars in Europe, but here in the US, not yet. And so that's one major difference. Also, in Europe, there is no additional interchangeability designation that is necessary. So once the European Medicines Agency approves a biosimilar, that also means that the biosimilar is interchangeable. And at that point, it is up to the individual state, the individual country to determine interchangeability at that point. But I think that's a pronounced difference. And lastly, we know that many European countries do have a single payer system. And so as those larger systems do endorse biosimilars, you see a lot broader and a lot quicker adoption rates of biosimilars. Here in the US, as I am talking about some of the commercial challenges with some of the benefit design really not providing access to biosimilars, does create a big barrier there. So I thought I would highlight that. One other slide he shared, which I thought was great, was the slide of all the biosimilars in the US and the market share that they each achieved. We all remember that filgrastim top line, the only biosimilar in the US that has more than a 50% market share. And so I think that, filgrastim is unique because it was the first biosimilar to really come into the US market. It was really unopposed there, other than having the reference product competition for a period of time. But personally, I think what has helped filgrastim, it's really the fact that this product is utilized significantly in the inpatient setting. And again, for us as providers, we're not at the mercy of a payer approval to be able to use filgrastim in the inpatient setting. And so I think that makes a very big difference. And as we move to see biosimilars for other products that are used on the inpatient setting, thinking about to a much lower extent, but thinking about rituximab, I think that there is a good opportunity to see a more rapid uptake of those biosimilars because, again, like the Kaiser model and other models, we're not subjected to payer restrictions there. Also, I thought it would be great to highlight in terms of celebrating a success, perhaps. I remember the days when all we had in the US market was the supportive care biosimilars, and we really worried that when we had therapeutic biosimilars, things like trastuzumab and bevacizumab, that we were going to have great hesitation, especially from providers and other clinicians in really getting behind these biosimilars. And what we have seen to date in the market is, in fact, that bevacizumab and trastuzumab have actually had pretty strong market uptake, with both of those products being pretty close to 50% market share. So I thought those were all great things to highlight. I'm not sure, Dr. Weingarten, if you have any additional comments on these points.
I think the thing I would add, which is exactly what you're saying in terms of Zarcio, where the incentives, you have to get the incentives right. So when you have prescriber, medicine, it's the incentives are all aligned, so it's easier to get that biosimilar used. And so I think when we're talking about some of these other biosimilars that we're struggling to gain market share, we're looking at the difference between the US uptake versus the uptake that happened in the EU. If you look at the incentives of the system, you can clearly see why it didn't happen here in the US, where there was these obstructions that in effect disincented the use of it, right? If you have rebates on your originator product that are just so large that if you fall below the required volume level, you're going to lose too much money, that becomes a huge barrier to the uptake of biosimilars. So I think your focus there on the incentives is exactly right. And then what we need to do is look at where the incentives are wrong, where the incentives disincentivize the use of biosimilars, and change those, because that's the major obstruction that's preventing kind of greater use and the availability or the obtaining of their savings.
Absolutely. And so we do have a question, and that is there advocacy efforts that you can discuss as far as making progress in increasing access? Well, I think as providers, we are a very, very important stakeholder in this industry. And so having communications with payers and other stakeholders about being good stewards of healthcare cost. I think for payers, it's very important that as providers, we become a lost cost of care site. And so I have constant communication with payers, and I ask them to have access to biosimilars so that we could achieve just that. And so I think it's just having those discussions ongoingly. We have had great success in the state of Florida working with payers directly, which had policies that did not cover biosimilars initially, but then we were able to add biosimilars to the policies. I also think it would be fair to say that payers have been doing a better job making sure that at least one biosimilar is in their benefits design. I think payers and some of the large national payers realized that keeping access to the reference product only was not in the best interest of patients and providers just having choices, and perhaps not in the best interest of overall healthcare and being good stewards of healthcare costs. So I am encountering in my own experience that payers are having policies that may not give you access to a full biosimilar portfolio, but at least they're giving you access to a handful of the biosimilars, and sometimes perhaps even including the reference product.
And I think other policy issues that if you think about like from a Medicare perspective, and Dr. Garcia had talked about kind of what the reimbursements are. And if you had statutorily in Medicare, instead of ASP plus 6%, but ASP plus 8% or a higher reimbursement rate for the biosimilar relative to biologic, under the idea that there need to be shared savings so that everyone benefits, the patient, the payer, and as well as the clinic or the provider from the savings that biosimilars offer. That type of approach is incredibly important in order to kind of, again, get those incentives correct and get more biosimilar use. And then I would also say a separate biosimilar tiers, to the extent that we can push that with different co-insurance rates. So again, encourage greater biosimilar use by sharing the savings with patients. Those types of reforms, I think, would improve the incentives and help with the uptake of biosimilars.
Well, I think that's such an important point. We know that the biosimilar market today needs to have better sustainability when it comes to a longer term pharmacoeconomics model. We know that today we don't follow that trickle down economics that Dr. Weingart is talking about. We need to make sure that there is a benefit to every stakeholder, including the patients. When you and I go to the pharmacy today, if we opt to receive a generic drug, we have a benefit in the form of lower copay. The health plan has a benefit because they're paying for a lesser cost medication. Pharmacies have now built a lot of economies of scale around generic medications to be able to drive cost savings for them. And so there's that very stable, sustainable generic model that has and will continue to provide cost savings and is balanced. And again, all the stakeholders are involved. I think we have some more work to do here before we achieve that in the biosimilar space. We do have another question in the chat box, and it says, can you discuss switching between reference drugs and biosimilars, and if there is likely to be an impact on the therapeutic effect? So this is a great question. To date, the FDA has not deemed any biosimilar interchangeable. However, we know that through institutional policies, many providers are able to independently interchange. And most importantly, we know that payers are really treating biosimilars as interchangeable because they're telling us to not use the reference product, but use a biosimilar or vice versa. And so we are seeing biosimilars and reference products being used interchangeably in real practice. Now, the studies that are in the literature today are really not well designed to detect differences when it comes to switching. And so the FDA has laid out unique guidance for manufacturers if they want to achieve that FDA interchangeability designation. They are calling for longer term studies. They're calling for multiple switches. They're calling from one arm remaining unchanged. And so at this point, it is uncertain whether pharmaceutical companies are going to be willing to invest additional resources to run these studies to get that FDA interchangeability designation. But what I can say is that now that we have 6+ years of pharmacovigilance information in the US, where we know our patients in the real world are being switched, we know some of our patients are being switched to extrapolated indications, and so every day that passes by with pharmacovigilance in place, we get additional confidence that biosimilars and reference products continue to perform even if you switch the patient, and that the patient's outcomes from a safety and efficacy standpoint continue to be at par. So I think that that's all we have to lean back on as of today. I think it's worthy noting that both in the US and the European market, no biosimilar has been removed from the market due to a safety or efficacy concern. So again, as we get more years of this, I think our level of confidence is going to increase with these interchangeabilities that we know have been happening in the marketplace. So with that, I think we have about a minute or two to close. Seeing no further questions in the chat box, I probably should say that biosimilars are still emerging in our country. I think as healthcare professionals, it's important for us to continue to evaluate the safety and efficacy evidence behind these products, and where there is safety and efficacy evidence that we enable access. I think for a long time, we as stakeholders in general, we as the US public, have asked pharmaceutical companies to try to help and do something to reduce drug cost. And many pharmaceutical companies listened. They took on this challenge of biosimilars, and I spoke about the many, many risks involved. And today we have biosimilars standing by, waiting to be used. So I think we do have that responsibility from the provider side to where there is good clinical evidence to support biosimilar use at a similar safety and efficacy level, that we at least enable that access so that the patients and providers can access those treatment options given the specific patient situation. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank Dr. Weingarten, the Flasco team, for bringing us all together to bring this biosimilar educational program to your homes this evening. Thank you so much from all of us.